there's something I feel like I have to address. There's a segment of people who watch my videos who, in the comment section, I've noticed, have their own preconceived notions which make them think that whenever I'm talking about the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, I'm talking about the Jews. So, no. And I really think that you're going to have to rehabilitate your thinking out of these kinds of assumptions.
Message!
Especially Muslims. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Jewish people here, nor am I going to enter into the controversy about what actually constitutes a Jew, whether it's an ethnic identity or a religious identity or both. But suffice it to say, that is not at all a clear issue. Personally, I agree with Shlomo Sand on this, in that it does my head in to think that someone can be an atheist and also Jewish. How you can not believe in or practice Judaism but still be regarded as a Jew doesn't make any sense to me, particularly since everyone who claims to be ethnically Jewish is actually a very complex genetic mix.
So I actually did want to say something about that because this comes up, has come up for me a lot. But but this is one thing, maybe the only thing in this video that where I would slightly, if not entirely, disagree. That if you read, as he suggests, Shlomo Sand's work, and I'm listening to it at least uh, on my daily walks, "The Invention of the Jewish People" by Shlomo Sand. Uh, if you read this or listen to it, and I'm about halfway through, and there's a few things that I think that are already clear in the book that if you do what Belson suggests in reading, it would contradict what he just said, because quite the opposite. That is, if you read Shlomo Sand's work, he makes a very clear argument. Well, he makes a very clear argument that as to how and why Jews of today feel a certain sense. That is the popular definition of Jews. I'm gonna come back to that quickly in a second. But how Jews of today, popularly conceived, have arrived at their self-concept, as a people, as a nation, and as a religion. So I won't pretend to understand or to be conversant in the history, but uh, Sands is Shlomo Sand. I keep saying Sands. Shlomo Sand is. So if Belson, and I think it seems logical. Sand seems to know what he's talking about. Um, and I agree with Belson that if we read and engage Sand's work, he has an answer. So there's a couple things already that what Sand says very clearly: today's Jew, nationally and conceptually as a people, is specifically a post World War II creation. That's what one of the most fascinating arguments for me, that this is a brand new conception, because as he goes through the history of Jews and Judaism, it ultimately, I think, it makes an argument that others have made with more hostility, but Sand makes the argument that the Jews we know of today, my mother's people, are not the Jews of antiquity. Now, if you've hung out in Black radical bookstores as much as I have, you know that part of the argument is not new, not always made with Sand's level of maybe concern, but the point about the imposter Jew and all of that, Sand makes a similar argument, in part because he says that all this stuff that in part everything that we claim, that people claim, I should say, not I wouldn't say, I'm certainly not a part of this group, But those who would argue from the so-called biblical tradition, his argument is that, and with a lot of citation and references and blah 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 blah, is that Moses did not exist. Moses is mythological, which again, if you hang out in those African-centered bookstores as much as I have, you already know this is true. Africans have been figured this out a long time ago, in part by, as Dr. Clark used to say, reading radical whites. So, but Sand seems to make a similar argument, again, with a lot more nuance and a lot more detail and a lot more argumentation. But and I'm just summarizing what I've gathered from about the first half of this book. But he's very clear. Moses didn't exist. All this stuff about exoduses and all the biblical stuff in there is just not real. uh, Including these claims of the two great dispersals of Jews. So this argument that there was this Jewish population in what is now supposed to be Israel that was dispersed thousands of years ago and is now only coming back to it, more recently to rightfully reclaim itself. Sand says that's not how it went. Sand says that's not how it went. Sand says, among other things, that Jews, originally the name for those living in Judea, not necessarily attached to a particular religion, or even ethnic group in particular, as we conceive of ethnicities today. That is, there was none of this. That first of all, they got dispersed, but that they were them they had themselves evolved a version of other borrowed. I mean, so this is the other thing. He points to some other, like they were borrowed anyway. So, but there was no dispersal and there was no return, is really the point that I'm getting at. And that the other part was that Jews did proselytize. This is something that has been new to me. That Judaism in the centuries and before the Common Era were proselytizing in a way that, as Sand says, we would associate today with Christians and Muslims. So this idea that Jews didn't do that, which is the way I've always understood it to be, uh, uh, was not the case. And that Jews were arguing, and one of the reasons that Jews developed an antipathy with existing power structures is because they were converting so many of the Greek and other whatever, Roman or whoever was, people to Jews. The point being, in addition to this proselytizing bit of history, is that the people who became Jews were not always the ones who were said to have been, quote unquote, born a Jew. And then there's this argument that Sand makes, that those who converted were more vigorous in their Judaism than those who were born into it, which I've thought, and I'll have to see how the book ends, would be a way to explain why those who say to themselves are the Jews by birth today are the most uh, uh, um, uh, they're the ones claiming the hardest to be in control of who can be a Jew, because they themselves were at one point, historically, many 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 years ago, converts who took the religion so seriously, and so on and so forth. So I thought, so again, massive proselytizing, Moses myth, and then I'll just leave it here. But Sand goes through and demonstrates what I noted here is a long and combative history, was the word I wrote in my notes, of the development, in terms of developing the people, the nation, and the mytho history around who is a Jew and what is a Jew. So yes, it does seem odd to say that there are many Jews who say that, as is the case with my mother, that they're Jews by peoplehood and ethnicity, but not by religion, because she was like, staunchly anti-religious. but but it makes sense. This history makes it more understandable how that seeming contradiction could arise, because of the more complicated, nuanced, and misunderstood history. So this again is the one reason why I thought, when I heard this initially, that especially in my ongoing listening to Sand's book, um, that Belsen has that part wrong. That in fact it does make sense that we would arrive at this contradiction, because as in my words, in my interpretation, all of this is some fakakta nonsense based on some mythologies that have been so heavily politicized and rewritten. And I mean, Sand points to specific authors and times and histories where and moments in history where these ideas coalesce, and it's over thousands of years, a couple of thousands of years. So but yeah, that part has been wild to me. That part has been wild to me. All right, but here we go. Let me get to the main part here.
We'll just have to go with the ill-defined blanket term Jew for the purposes of this discussion. So are the Jews all rich, and do they own everything? Well, let me first break down global ownership of wealth. 55% of global wealth is owned by Christians. 35% of global wealth is owned by non-religious people, people of no religion. 6% of global wealth is owned by Muslims. 3% is owned by Hindus. And 1% of global wealth is owned by Jews. So here, of course, you're going to actually run into that issue of what a Jew really is, because obviously within that 35% of non-religious people who own wealth, there's going to be some atheistic, non-religious Jews there who consider themselves Jews, but are not religiously affiliated with Judaism in any way. But be that as it may, Christians own significantly more wealth than Jews globally. Okay, now, according to Forbes magazine, there are 267 Jewish billionaires. Again, that includes both religious and non-religious Jews. And that's out of a total number of billionaires in the world of 2,668. So roughly 10% are Jewish, and 90% of billionaires are not Jewish. Around 2% of the millionaires in the world are Jewish, but around 7% of the millionaires in the world are Muslim. So the Jews aren't really surpassing anyone in that regard. The ratio of Jews with higher incomes in the United States specifically is higher than the ratio of higher income people relative to the general population. 24% of religious Jews and 21% of non-religious Jews have annual incomes higher than $200,000 a year. But around 47% of all American Jews earn $50K or less per year, which puts them more or less squarely in the middle class. And it's around the same.
What did you just say there?
50K or less per year.
Wait a minute.
More or less K or less of religious Jews and 21% of non-religious Jews have annual incomes higher than $200,000 a year. But around 47% of all American Jews earn $50K or less per year, which puts them more or less squarely in the middle class. And it's around the same percentage as the general population, around 50%, around half of the American population is middle class.
So I missed that the first time I watched this. That part is interesting. 47% of American Jews make $50,000 or less. That's I knew Jews don't do as well as is often stereotypically asserted, but that part was a little bit is surprising to me.
So there's nothing particularly stunning there either. But you know, a more interesting thing to look at is actually the global ownership of investment capital by religious groups. The University of Oxford actually did a study of 360 faith-based investment organizations, and they found that Christian-aligned capital totaled around $260 billion. Hindu and Buddhist-aligned capital actually totaled around $300 billion, while Jewish-aligned capital was only around $16 billion. But when they looked at Muslim sovereign capital and private finance capital, that totaled a whopping $4 trillion. So 16 billion is considerably less than 4 trillion. But okay, so I know that when the Jews are the richest and they own everything assumption gets disproven, the standby argument as the go-to is, okay, it's not just about the wealth, it's about how they use it and which sectors of the economy they are strategically using their wealth in and where they place themselves to give them disproportionate control. I mean, the Jews own all the banks, right?
Right.
And big tech and the media. Okay, let's see. Let's start with the banks. First of all, Of the top 10 biggest banks in the world, half of them are in China, so that's a non-starter. The biggest American bank is JP Morgan Chase, which is predominantly owned by institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Of the top 5 individual investors in JP Morgan Chase, 2 of them are Jewish. The next largest Western bank is PNB Paribas in France, which is 92% owned by institutional investors,
Hold on a
and
second.
the
Hold on
CEO
one
was
second. One
State
second.
Street.
One second.
Of the top 5 individual and big tech, and the Jews are the richest and they own everything assumption gets disproven, the standby argument as the go-to is, okay, it's not just about the wealth, it's about how they use it and which sectors of the economy they are strategically using their wealth in and where they place themselves to give them disproportionate control. I mean, the Jews own all the banks, right? And big tech and the media. Okay, let's see. Let's start with the banks. First of all, of the top 10 biggest banks in the world, half of them are in China, so that's a non-starter.
Okay.
The biggest American bank is JP Morgan Chase, which is predominantly owned by institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Of the top 5 individual investors in JP Morgan Chase, 2 of them are Jewish. The next largest Western
That's
bank
one
is
thing that I
PNB.
don't remember him. We'll have to see because I don't remember how he deals with this question. I know he comes back to this question of institutional investor, but that was something that I thought about, and I don't know that it technically is fully answered here because, and I know it's all, and I've in the past I've tried to look it up myself, and it's very difficult. But Larry Fink, who heads BlackRock, is a Jew. And it's beyond that, we don't know who are the dominant investors in those institutional investors. So technically, if people wanted to make more of an argument, to challenge Belson, they could do that and say, well, who comprises these institutional vehicles like Vanguard and BlackRock and State Street and so on and so forth, because they're everywhere and they own everything. But so that's just one thing. But I think, but he does come back to it. So
Paribas in France, which is 92% owned by institutional investors, and the CEO was accused of anti-Semitism and of forcing employees to view Hitler in a positive light in a training video that was circulated internally to the bank. So much for the Jewish influence on that particular bank. And then the next bank we have is Bank of America, which is again predominantly owned by institutional investors, led by Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett, who is not a Jew. And Warren Buffett is also the largest private individual shareholder in Wells Fargo, with the rest being institutional investors. And the same pretty much goes for Citigroup as well, and you can sort of see the pattern. Look, the idea of Jews controlling banking is basically born out of the old history of Jews in Europe when the Christian church was the dominant political power, and they prohibited Christians from engaging in riba, in interest. But they didn't prohibit Jews from doing so. So Jews became moneylenders, became financiers, and founded banks. But this history is very old, and it's obsolete, and it has been for a long time. But also, private individual ownership of banks and companies is virtually obsolete as well, which is why the whole notion of exclusive Jewish control or even disproportionate control over anything is just not feasible.
So that's what. So this is another point. I really like that he makes this point here. One about this history, because again, as I started to want to revisit this issue or these issues, that was one of the points. And he, as Belson started, he's asking Muslims largely to challenge their own thinking, and I'm doing the same for Black folks in particular, but everybody in general as well. That history of how do people end up in certain parts of the economy it's important and does have a history. But then this other point that he makes is the macro version of Two Blacks argument around the interlocked relationship of the economy and of goods and services. So, in the same way that we've been arguing, you can't segregate to borrow from Mirza Baradaran, you can't segregate an economy, you can segregate people. This is what he's saying here. There is no separate individual ownership of a thing once the ruling elite that do have a diversity, equity, and inclusive element to themselves get involved. So yeah, I'm glad he made that point.
All of these institutions have literally layers upon layers upon layers of owners. The institutional investors, the institutional shareholders, are largely asset management companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who themselves are beholden to their shareholders and their investors. So what it actually comes down to is just rich people. And again, most rich people are not Jewish. Okay, so now let's look at big tech. The big five, that's Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft. Okay, so Alphabet, again, the majority shareholders are institutional investors. But the two largest individual shareholders are the two founders of Google, who are both Jewish. The largest individual shareholders of Amazon are Jeff Bezos, who is not Jewish, and Andy Jassy, who is Jewish. And Amazon is the same thing. Institutional investors are the majority shareholders, but you have the individual investors, the largest of which is Jeff Bezos, who is not Jewish, and Andy Jassy, who is Jewish. Apple is owned by institutional investors led by Vanguard and Berkshire Hathaway, again, which is Warren Buffett, who is not a Jew. And the biggest individual shareholder is Tim Cook, who is also not Jewish. The controlling shareholder of Meta is, of course, Mark Zuckerberg, who is Jewish, but the company is 74% owned by institutional investors. As for Microsoft, of course, Bill Gates is not Jewish, nor are the top three individual shareholders of Microsoft. And yet again, the company is mostly owned by institutional investors. So basically, you just have Google and Meta, where there are Jewish people with powerful shareholding control. But that control is always mitigated by the fact that these are public companies which are accountable to an ocean of institutional investors. So what about media? The largest media conglomerates in America are AT&T, Comcast, Disney, News Corp, Fox, and Sony. Between them, they own most of the television networks, film studios, publishers, newspapers, TV channels, and so on. In addition to these conglomerates, there are a little over a dozen individual billionaires with significant media holdings. Most of these media conglomerates are public companies. And
this is one thing that I do know he doesn't get to, that I think would have to be added to complete his analysis here, is that so he doesn't mention in that constellation of media so much of what is happening on the internet. So in terms of podcasts, even if you consider Google and its ownership by Alphabet of YouTube, or what has to be incorporated into this analysis are the dominant ad buyers. So because ad revenue determines content. So Procter and Gamble, for instance, I think is organizationally the dominant ad buyer. But who are the people who? So if you wanted to add to this analysis, it would have to include where are Jews in particular in relationship to Procter and Gamble and all these other dominant ad buyers who are spending the $600 billion a year. Making sure that we see what we end up seeing, because that more than the ownership of the media outlet determines the content. So that would be one area that maybe I could come back and help bolster his analysis with.
They are majority owned by institutional investors. So bear that in mind. When it's owned by institutional investors, it means that it is owned by an ocean of nameless, faceless, rich people, most of whom are not Jewish. So you have institutional investors, and then you have the individual investors. In all of these companies, the overwhelming majority of ownership is with institutions. There's a small slice of these companies where there are individual investors. So the largest individual investor for, say, Comcast, he is a Jew. The largest individual shareholder of AT&T is not Jewish. Of the top three individual shareholders of Disney, 2 are Jewish. The top individual shareholders of News Corp are not Jewish. The major individual shareholders of Fox are the Murdoch family, who are not Jewish and even have been accused of anti-Semitism. And Sony, of course, is also not Jewish owned. And then out of the 14 or 15 billionaires with significant media holdings, which means local and national newspapers, radio stations, television channels, and so on, out of that 14 or 15 people, 5 of them are Jews. So banking, big tech, and media, there is not actually significant Jewish ownership.
And does he do
Now,
by
if he wanted
percentage
to,
of population too? I don't remember him doing, like, in terms of if there's 5 out of 15 of these billionaires or whatever, owners or whatever, who are Jews, what percentage of the population per their hour, you know what I'm saying. But again, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate and steel man the opposition, so to speak. But yeah,
dig deeper, because you're not satisfied with that, and say it's not about the ownership, it's about the executives, it's about the CEOs, it's about the management, because they can control what the company does, then you don't understand how corporations work. Even if you discovered that there was an overrepresentation of Jews in positions of CEO or executive positions or management positions, it wouldn't matter. In the corporate model, CEOs and management are completely subordinate to shareholders. It means they cannot use.
So what's going on over here on Patreon? What is this situation here? Maybe what? Yeah, why did it do that? All right, hold on.
Their positions to pursue some ideological agenda. They must use their positions strictly and exclusively to pursue the benefit of shareholders. And if they don't, they will lose their jobs. Okay, so we've gone through banking, we've gone through media, we've gone through big tech. What's left? Well, political power, right? The Jews control political policy, right? Okay, let's look at it. What is referred to as the pro-Israel lobby or the Jewish lobby is actually an assortment or a collection of pro-Jewish, pro-Israeli lobbies and political action committees like, say, J Street or IPAC, names that you might know, as well as a few lesser-known organizations. So in the latest numbers that we have, which are from 2021 to 2022, the combined Jewish lobbies contributed a total of $30 million to politicians in Washington. That sounds like a lot, right? Well, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in that same amount of time spent $100 million. Look, Muslims have to understand, U.S. support for Israel has nothing to do with the Jewish lobby. They have historically supported Israel because it is beneficial for them to do so. And in terms of lobbying, no one benefits more from U.S. policy towards Israel than the defense industry. And the defense industry consistently outspends the Jewish lobby in every election cycle by tens of millions of dollars. But it's in everyone's interest to pretend that the Jewish lobby is that powerful. For the Jewish lobbyists themselves, obviously, they can pretend that they are highly effective and sell their services to their Jewish communities so that they can garner more support and more donations, more contributions to make them richer.
By the way, that's the Israeli lobby version of the buying power myth, that to justify their own existence, the conservative Israeli lobby behaves as the black commercial press and promotes that they can deliver an audience should they be supported and invested in, and then promote to that audience that the lobbying they do is absolutely essential. In the same way, the commercial press tells its audience that it's providing an absolutely essential service, despite, at least in the areas of financial literacy, so-called, there's a lot of misinformation. And then they use that audience to go to their donors and supporters to justify the investment, i.e. the ad revenue. So, and in each case, the audience is misled and done a disservice. And those who actually benefit from the exchange are left largely anonymous and able to do whatever they want to do.
Based on the idea that they're just incredibly influential. And for everyone else, it allows them to deflect responsibility for policies by blaming the all-powerful Jewish lobby. So to conclude, Jews are among the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, primarily or predominantly as the controllers, which, despite what the name might suggest, is a subordinate position to the owners of capital. But the Jews are by no means the dominant players in this class. Furthermore, I would like to say that Jews are not monolithic in their ideology, certainly not extremely wealthy Jews. You know, in the ayah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the Jews, you think that they're united but their hearts are divided. That ayah isn't about the Jews. That ayah is about us. Because Allah isn't pointing out some unique thing about the division between the hearts of the Jews. Division is a very normal de facto state between human beings. What is unique that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is drawing our attention to is our belief that they are united. He is pointing out to us the error of our assumption. And yet many of us continue to hold that assumption. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they won't fight you unless they are behind a wall or in a high fortress, and that unless they are under a covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or a treaty with people more powerful than them, they will be in a weakened and subject state. And this, of course, is true, and history bears it out. It's the classic position of any people who generally operate as middleman minorities. They are reliant upon others for their security, financial and otherwise. So you take someone like Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock and who is a Jew. He's a middleman. His position depends upon the approval,
right, Renee,
of those who own the assets that he manages on their behalf. This is how such a tiny group of people were able to survive more or less cohesively for thousands of years. The Jews highly value education and on average spend more years in school than most people. And unsurprisingly, they reap the benefits of that in their professional careers and their incomes. But no, the Jews are not the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. That's absurd. And that's all based on old conspiracy theories of European and Christian anti-Semites. But the Jews are as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described them, not as the Nazis described them. Jazakumullahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Hey. So that video, I think the link is already in the show description, even here on Patreon. But this was uploaded. Oh, I'm sorry. It's older than I thought. It was uploaded April 3rd, 2023. So it's a couple of years old. But it was sent to me, well, actually, over the last couple of months, a few times. So the name of the YouTube channel is Middle Nation. Middle Nation. And if it's not already, I'll make sure the link is in the show description whenever this gets wherever it's. However, I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen with the video. So I definitely so I saw a couple of questions. So my birthday is Sunday, September 28th. I'm thinking of doing a birthday live here on Patreon just to hang out since I'm not likely to go anywhere or do much of anything. And it's my birthday. Why not? You know what I mean? But I thought the video. So again, I appreciate Belson with what he's doing there, and even the Shlomo Sand book. I'm telling you, if folks are, I mean, if you're interested, I'd like to come back to it, and it's fascinating. A lot of history in there. There's a lot in there that. But again, I get it. It's a bunch of competing, confused, and his point about the elite not being monolithic makes perfect sense given what Shlomo Sand is writing, because the version, the dominant narrative was the result of a couple thousands of years of the ruling elite beefing with each other over which version was going to rule out which form of Judaism, what were the rules of Judaism, who could be a Jew, who couldn't be a Jew. A lot of the stuff that people talk about, according to Sand, in terms of everything from Moses to the Maccabees to all this other, is just not supported by the history. And then he shows the points where people not conspired, but they intended to create their preferred narrative. And of course, because the only people who could do all this reading and writing in multiple languages were the elite. This was just a competition of the elite. And then everybody else sort of got dragged along, whether they were converts or born into it. And where we are today with Israel and who is and who isn't a Jew is a concoction, according to Shlomo Sand, of the last 75, 80 years. It's some brand new. And yeah, Renee, yeah, you take credit for it. You got me. You got me on the listening thing. I mean, and to be perfectly honest, with the way I read a lot nowadays, I don't see there's much of a difference in terms of what I do or don't retain and what so sometimes I pause to make a note or this, that, and the third, or what. And then, I could read 20 pages and feel like I don't even know what I was just doing. In the same way, I could walk for a few minutes and be like, wait a minute, I got to rewind that because I don't even know what I just listened to. So, however people feel about listening versus reading, it is what it is, but it has been very helpful, and I'm enjoying it. And so salute to Renee again. But yeah, so I would for those who wanted my opinion on Belsen's video, I co-sign, and I appreciate what he's doing. He's talking to his Muslim audience and saying we got to think better, we got to think more critically, and that's all I would ever ask of anybody who pays attention to me. We got to think more critically. We got to have a better analysis. Remember, this started with me saying we have no analysis of Jews, and we don't. What is the prevailing narrative among Black people in even radical spaces about Jews is just incorrect. And the dominant narrative among Jews is incorrect. Jews are operating on a whole. It reminds me that line, and then I'll wrap here, but it reminds me of that line from Charles Mills, where he said white folks have created so many consensual hallucinations that they can't even interpret the world they've created. Golly. Salute to Charles Mills.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
That was absolutely bars. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming through on this live test. And if you don't have plans, Sunday, September 28th, that is before we maybe collectively tune into the Ear Doctor over on Black Liberation Media, save the date. We might hang out, do some virtual hangout, and I'll probably finish that last bit of Uncle Nearest. Pour some out for the Black business community. All right, everybody, big peace. Only because I know you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll see you around here on my birthday. Or, probably before then once or twice, but all right. Let's wrap it up. Thanks, everybody.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, that set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything.
I mix what I like.